Introduction to Genetics. Lesson objectives. Students will be able to distinguish between recessive and dominant traits, learn what genes are and how they determine traits, learn how to calculate the likelihood of receiving a genetic trait, learn how to use the Punnett square to determine recessive and dominant traits. So, quick review. So before school closed, we started learning about the differences between asexual and sexual reproduction. So let's go over those similarities and differences. So we know that reproduction results in offspring or a new generation of organisms, right? So both asexual and sexual reproduction produce offspring, and both forms of reproduction pass genetic information from parent to offspring. Now, asexual reproduction only involves one parent. That means that the offspring will get 100% of their DNA from that one parent. So they will be genetically identical to the parent, and then they will also be genetically identical to other offspring from the same parent. An advantage of asexual reproduction is that it does not require mating, so it can produce many offspring in a very short period of time. It results in little to no genetic variation. That means that the genes of those offspring are not going to be different from one another. They're going to be identical. But there's a greater chance for harmful mutations to be passed on. Now, sexual reproduction, on the other hand, involves two parents. Offspring gets 50% of its DNA from each parent. Therefore, they're different from the parents, and they're also different from each other. It requires mating. A disadvantage is that it takes more time and energy. But an advantage is that genetic variation gives species a greater chance of survival if their environment changes. There's a lower chance for harmful mutations to be passed on, and it involves the processes of meiosis, which is the production of gametes, also known as sex cells, and fertilization, which is when those sex cells combine and join their DNA. So let's recall what a gene is. So remember that genes are segments or sections of DNA that code for a specific trait. So now we're going to watch this video that's going to give you a brief overview of what genetics is.
Ugh, my brother can curl his tongue. So can my mom. But I can pretty much conclude now that it's not a matter of practice or technique. It has to do with how physical characteristics were passed from my parents to my brother and to me. In other words, it has to do with genetics. What is genetics? All living things have observable characteristics called traits. Traits are often things that we can see, like hair color and texture, eye color, or even the ability to roll your tongue, or not, in my case. These traits are passed from parent to child. The study of how living things pass on traits from one generation to another is called genetics. By learning the basics of genetics, we will find out how living things inherit features from their parents, and why children with the same parents might inherit different features than their siblings. A scientist who studies genetics is called a geneticist. The first geneticist was an Austrian monk and biologist named Gregor Mendel, who lived from 1811 to 1884. Mendel loved to work with and study the plants in the monastery garden. He became fascinated with all the different variations or types of pea plants. He observed that some plants grew taller than others. Some had yellow seeds, while others produced green seeds. What did all of these plants have in common? And what made them all slightly different? Mendel created experiments to see if he could produce particular traits by mixing the seeds of certain plants. He wanted to know how traits were passed from one generation of pea plants to the next. After doing more than 29,000 experiments mixing and studying pea plants, Mendel discovered that, over many generations, certain traits appeared in a pattern. For example, when he mixed a pure yellow seed with a pure green seed, the offspring plants had only yellow seeds. This led him to believe that the trait of the yellow color was dominant over the trait of the green color. Or the yellow color was strong enough to express itself and be seen. Mendel's next step was to mix these new yellow-seeded plants with each other. The offspring from this mixture produced mostly yellow-seeded plants, but one plant had green seeds. How could this have happened? Mendel concluded that the green color must have been present in the yellow-seeded parents. He believed that stronger yellow color must have been strong enough to keep the green color hidden in the parents. He called the green color recessive because it was not seen as often. After all of his experiments, Mendel figured out that each trait we inherit depends on factors that come from both our mother and our father. Gregor Mendel became known as the father of genetics. We are off to a good start in learning about how traits are passed from parents to offspring. Let's review what we just learned. Question 1. What do we call the study of living things and how they inherit traits from one generation to the next? A. Biology. B. Physics. C. Chemistry. D. Genetics. The correct answer is D. The study of how traits are passed is called genetics. Question 2. What type of plants did Gregor Mendel use for his experiments? A. Pea plants. B. Tomato plants. C. Ferns. D. None of the above. If you answered A, you know that Mendel experimented with pea plants. Question 3. What nickname was given to Gregor Mendel? A. Genetics King. B. Father of Genetics. C. Science Monk. D. Friar of Plants. The correct answer is B. Mendel is known as the father of genetics.
Alright, so genetics is the study of living things and how they inherit traits from one generation to the next. Traits are genetically determined conditions or characteristics. So the ability to roll your tongue or not having the ability to roll your tongue is a genetic trait. Having a widow's peak versus having a straight hairline, or having attached earlobes versus having unattached earlobes, having a hitchhiker's thumb versus having a straight thumb, having freckles, having a chin dimple, or having hair on your knuckles, or having your second toe longer than your big toe. Those are all genetic traits. Heredity is the passing of traits or characteristics from parent to offspring. So for example, here the child would get his hair color from his dad. So this is a word that you guys have seen before, allele. So you know that a gene determines or codes for a specific trait, right? Well, an allele is just a different variation of a gene. So humans get 2 copies of every single gene, 1 copy from each parent. The 2 copies don't have to be identical. So each variation or each different form of a gene is called an allele. So for example, if a gene contains information for eye color, one allele might code for blue eyes and another might code for brown eyes. Alleles create diversity. Now, the video mentioned dominant traits and recessive traits, so let's take a look at what those things are. So a dominant trait is a genetic trait that's passed from parent to child that is more likely to be expressed. So in this case, brown eyes would be a dominant trait. Recessive traits, on the other hand, are masked or hidden when a dominant gene is present. So if somebody inherits a brown eye allele from one parent and a blue eye allele from the other parent, they will have brown eyes because brown is dominant, and the blue will be masked or hidden because it is recessive. So now we're going to take a look at how we can predict the probability of inheriting a certain physical trait. And we do that by using models called Punnett squares. So this video is going to explain how Punnett squares help us predict the likelihood or the probability of inheriting a certain trait.
Let's take a look at the case for the color of a rabbit's coat and set it up with a Punnett square. The B allele produces a black coat, and the B allele produces a white coat. Let's use a scenario where both.
So notice, capital B stands for the black coat, and lowercase b stands for the white coat.
Parents have the genotype BB. When we work the combinations using the Punnett square, we can see what genotypes can be present in the offspring. In this example, we can see the probability of the offspring having a genotype of BB is 25%, BB is 50%, and BB is 25%.
So let's take a closer look at this. So when we're looking at two alleles for a single gene, so let's say coat color, the capital letter represents the dominant allele. So in this case, what would the dominant allele be? That's right, the black coat would be the dominant allele. That means that the white coat, or the lowercase b, would be the recessive allele. So these are the different combinations of alleles that the offspring from those parents can inherit. So if it inherits two capital Bs, then it will have a black coat because it has two of those dominant black coat alleles. Now, if it has one allele for black coat, which is the capital B, and one allele for white coat, which is the lowercase b, it will still have a black coat because, again, a black coat is dominant over a white coat. So that white allele is going to be masked or hidden by that dominant allele. The only way that the rabbit will have a white coat is if it inherits two of those recessive alleles, two of those lowercase b's for the white coat. So when it breaks it down, each square in that Punnett square represents a quarter, right? Or 25%. So there's a 25% chance that the offspring will have capital B, capital B. There's a 50% chance that the offspring will have capital B, lowercase b, because it's here and it's here. And then again, there's a 25% chance that the offspring will have lowercase b, or have a white coat.
It is important to note that the Punnett square only provides us with a probability of genotypes, not the resulting phenotypes of the offspring. Remember, phenotypes are a result of how different genotypes are expressed.
Right, so that introduced two new vocabulary words, genotype and phenotype. So it's very important that you understand the difference between these two terms. So a genotype is the combination of alleles that an organism inherits from its parents. So the actual genes that it inherits. So in this case, we're looking at the genotype for widow's peak. So widow's peak is a dominant trait. So the capital W represents inheriting the allele for widow's peak. So This would be the genotype for somebody who inherits two dominant alleles for widow's peak. This would be, this right here would be the genotype for somebody who inherits one dominant allele for widow's peak and then one recessive allele for a straight hairline. But obviously, they're going to have the widow's peak because the widow's peak is dominant, while the straight hairline is recessive, so it will be masked by that dominant allele. So the genotype for a straight hairline would be lowercase w because it is recessive. So the only way it will show up is if that dominant allele is not present. So here we don't have a capital W, so the person is going to inherit a straight hairline. So now we get to the phenotype. The phenotype is the actual appearance, the physical characteristic or the physical expression of that genetic of that genetic combination. So in this case, the phenotype would be having a widow's peak. And in this case, the phenotype would be having a straight hairline. So phenotype is the physical characteristic. That's why we have PH for physical, and then we have GEN for genes. So it's a good way to remember. Okay, so this last video is going to talk a little bit more specifically about a few of the things that Mendel discovered when he was studying and experimenting with those pea plants. And it's going to give you a closer look and a little bit more practice with using Punnett squares. So let's take a look.
Your height, the shape of your nose, your complexion, everything that makes you a unique individual are all passed down to you from your parents. These are all referred to as traits.
But what determines which traits will be passed down?
That was the same question asked by Austrian monk Gregor Mendel more than 100 years ago, and he decided to find the answer. Working with pea plants, Mendel learned several important rules about heredity. One was that an individual carried two factors, or genes, for each trait, but passed down only one. Another rule was that one of the factors, or genes, was dominant over the other.
Dominant?
That means it has more influence or power over the other. Let's use a simple example to explore these rules. If this black rabbit and white rabbit were to mate, what color do you suppose their offspring would be?
I don't know. Black? Maybe white? How about gray?
No need to guess. To find out, we'll use a simple diagram called a Punnett square. We'll assume there'll be 4 offspring, 1 for each square. 1, 2, 3, and 4. Next, we'll put the black rabbit here on the left, and the white rabbit on top. According to the rules discovered by Mendel, we know that each rabbit carries 2 genes that control color. Let's say the black one is purebred for black.
Purebred?
That means both of its genes are black. We'll refer to them as capital F, capital F. F is for fur. The white rabbit is also purebred. That means that both of its genes are white. We'll refer to them as small f, small f.
Which genes will the offspring inherit?
Since the black rabbit carries only 2 black genes, capital F, it can only pass down a black gene to each one of the 4 offspring. Since the white rabbit carries only 2 white genes, small f, it can only pass down a white gene. Each of the 4 offspring end up with both a black gene and a white gene. But each will be black because black is dominant. They may look exactly like the black parent, but there is a big difference. These offspring are no longer purebred, but are now called hybrids. They carry both a white gene and a black gene. The black trait is dominant, and the white trait is recessive.
Recessive?
That means it's hidden.
Well, what would happen if two hybrid rabbits were to mate?
Let's do another diagram using a Punnett square. This offspring will receive a black gene from the parent on the left and a black gene from the parent on top. It will end up capital F, and will be purebred black. This offspring will get a black gene from the parent on the left and a white gene from the parent on top. It will end up capital F, but will be black because black is dominant. This offspring will end up with a white gene from the parent on the left and a black gene from the parent on top. It will end up small f, capital F, but will be black because, again, black is dominant. Finally, this offspring will end up with a white gene from the parent on the left and a white gene from the parent on top. What color will it be?
It has only white genes, so it has to be white.
Good. Now, which offspring gets which gene is completely up to chance. All we know for sure is that about 1 in 4 will be white. None of the rabbits will be gray, by the way, because in this example, these traits are not blended. The same rules of inheritance apply to many of the traits found in all plants and animals. If you were to cross hybrid purple corn with hybrid yellow corn, what would be the result?
That would depend on which color is dominant.
Right. And since purple is dominant, the ears would have kernels that are about 75% purple and 25% yellow. 3 to 1.
Okay, so that last video talked about purebred versus hybrid. So I kind of just wanted to break down those two terms. So when he talked about the purebred rabbits, they were the ones that only contained um, identical alleles for coat color. So they either contained two capital B's for black coat or two lowercase b's for white coat. So if we look at that eye color example, um, that would mean a person inherits two lowercase b's for blue eyes or two uppercase b's for brown eyes. This is also known as being homozygous because they inherit the two same alleles for that trait. So homo means the same. Now, the video also talked about hybrids. So hybrids have two different alleles for a specific trait. This is also known as heterozygous. So you guys have seen these prefixes before. You should remember that hetero means different. So in this case, if you cross a parent with who is homozygous for brown eyes, that means they have two uppercase B's, and another parent who is homozygous for blue eyes, that means they have two lowercase b's because it is the recessive allele, then the offspring will all inherit one big B from the first parent and one little b from the second parent, making them heterozygous or hybrid. So even though their eyes are going to be brown, their genotype is different from the homozygous parent because the homozygous parent has big B, whereas the offspring will all have big B, little b. And you guys are gonna get a closer look and get some hands-on practice with working with Punnett squares. So that is going to be explained further under the assignments. But that is it for today's lesson. So please review this closely. You can rewind and watch it as many times as you need to.